Thank you so much to Betsy, to the leadership and the staff at the Alliance Française. It's been so wonderful. I'm really honored to be here. I'm honored to introduce. So it's a special, really a special delight for me. And also, this is my first public lecture with real people, and you are real. I see you, and I'm delighted that there are so many people also watching and online, first public lecture since the pandemic. So we're kicking back things once again. So as you see, the title of my talk today is Experiencing the Gardens of Versailles. And as we heard, I'll be emphasizing that experience of being in the garden rather than garden history or how to plant gardens, of which I know extremely little. Although I love, I have a very, very small garden, which I enjoy very much spending time in. But the subtitle is perhaps more important. Art, play, and power. And just for a second, I just want to think about that interplay between those notions. Art and play, I think we all know, are deeply associated. There are many theories about the origins of art as being an extension of play. One of the greatest forms of art, one very much practiced in the gardens of Versailles, is theater. Of course, in English, we say that a play, to speak of a dramatic work. In French, the term isn't used, but one talks about jouer une pièce de théâtre, one plays a play. And Kant's theory of aesthetics, for example, says that the very notion of what we do when we watch art is that we can engage in a free play of our mind, liberated from some of the constraints of logic and yet still thinking, but in a free way. And that interplay between freedom and art is very complicated. Art in the classical periods and the French 17th century was often associated with sets of rules, with guidelines, with techniques, which suggest a sense of control, but also with a kind of freedom of ambiguity, a freedom of experiencing different emotions. So that interplay between control and freedom is something that I really want to think about today as we think about going through the gardens. And power. Power is essential here. I think, as you all know, Versailles was established by Louis XIV to become the capital of the capital of France, precisely to take power away from the busy city of Paris, which was subject to the emotions of the people, to isolate power. And part of that project of projecting and containing power at Versailles was to make France the cultural leader of Europe. This is a work that had been going on for many decades with the foundation of the Académie Française, the French Academy, designed to regulate and promote the French language as the language of Europe. This was done under his father, Louis XIII. And the exercise of soft power, as we say today, was central to Louis XIV's idea of French expansion, both within Europe and internationally. And Versailles was to represent both, in many ways, the hard economic power of France, but also the soft cultural power of France. Now, this means in many ways, we can think of this whole project of the gardens and the arts in it as a form of propaganda, right? Now, nobody really likes propagandistic art. It's simplified, it seeks, in a sense, to submit us to power. But art is a double-edged sword. And in this sense, the very art, the very desire to create in France a golden age that would not only equal, but surpass that of the Augustus of Rome, with the great poets as Virgil and Horace, Ovid, that very idea to make France the center of art is part of a projection of power, but art is never contained easily. Art is explosive. Art is open to the ambiguities of its presentation and to our own perceptions of it, which means that art very often can be subversive. And the greatest art can be a critique of power. And so this very notion of a sort of enormous projection of power, propaganda campaign with art in a sense, found seeds of its own undoing. That's the themes that we'll be looking at today as we examine the gardens. Now, I want to start with this first image, which I think gives you a great sense of the central perspective of the gardens of Versailles. This is seen from the Apollo fountain, which you have. Oh, sorry, I've got to. There we go, getting used to, I have two different controls here. You see okay, this will take 1 second, there we go. And now I'm going to get the laser function, yes. Apollo on his chariot as he begins the sunrise. This is the central east-west axis of the gardens of Versailles. You'll notice the line of sculptures. This is central. This is the world's largest outdoor sculpture gallery, Versailles. There are hundreds of sculptures at Versailles. And then finally, in the background, you see the palace itself. And this is the principal facade of the Palace of Versailles. It is the garden facade. And in many ways, the gardens from the initiation of Versailles were seen as, in a sense, the seat of power. Inside the gardens was the palace. So the gardens were absolutely integral to the entire notion of Versailles. Now, I want you to think also about this central axis, the strong rectilinear and geometrical perspective of the gardens. This is the Age of Reason. This is Louis XIV follows quickly on the work of Descartes, for example. Geometry was highly prized at the time, and the idea of geometricizing art, making it more regular, more rational, was absolutely crucial at the time. But as we'll see, it's a little more complicated than simply geometric formations. Why? As you know, first of all, those formations are often quite complicated, but in a garden, what are they composed of? They're composed of highly mutable matter. They're composed of water, the fountains. We'll spend a lot of time with the fountains of Versailles. Fountains can be directed, hydraulics, the channeling of water controls it to a certain degree, but no one can control every droplet. No one can control the wind moving through. It is, in a sense, the most uncontrollable element. And of course, vegetation. We have lawn, we have shrubbery, we have the trees, which are subject, of course, to growth. There is trimmed and trained and pruned as they may be. They're always irregular. One of the great philosophers of the late 17th and early 18th century, Leibniz, wrote extensively on how every leaf is entirely different from another. Every form of vegetation, its own particular form. So that element of geometry I want to stress. And here we see one of the major parterres. And again, once again, the geometric patterns dominate the rectilinear forms, and yet right away, there are complications. There are diagonals, there are ovals. And most interesting, perhaps for us, are these labyrinthine decorative friezes composed of vegetation. So to think of this as only geometrical, and that's often the idea. Le Nôtre, we'll talk a little bit about him, the garden designer, is associated with, obviously, Versailles representing the height of the French formal garden, which obeys strict geometric rules, but within those rules, there's immense amount of freedom for decorative and even Baroque excess. Now, I'm going to pull back one step further and see how those geometric forms, which you see here highlighted, allow for even more freedom, because once one leaves this sort of central axis with the parterres, with the highly pruned miniature shrubbery, and the fountains, one enters the world of the groves. These are, so to speak, architectural rooms made of vegetation, made of trees and shrubs and architectural elements, pavilions, and decorated with art. We're going to spend time in those. But they allow, at times, for wooded areas, for a certain kind of freedom. They were also very much sites for personal experience, all forms of intercourse. From flirtation to consummation, it all took place in those groves, right? And Louis XIV's early period is precisely that of what was called the roi galant, the gallant king, right? Who had an enormous number of affairs and mistresses in those first 20 years of his rule, and which play an important part often in the creation of the festivities that we'll look at. I'm going to look back a second at this sort of central configuration, if you will, of the symmetry of Versailles. That may be me. And then I'm going to turn to see that in most cases, very often, back here a second, the gardens of Versailles have been transformed at times. Many of the groves or bosquets have shifted over times, we'll see that. But in fact, some of it is extremely well preserved. Just going back and forth, here you see, this is the 17th century design, still in place. And just looking at that design, I just wanted to think again about the experience of that kind of geometry, which is highly associated with French classicism. And what I've done is I've paired here the Le Nôtre's design for the gardens in the 1670s with a play from the same period, Racine's Andromaque. Theater and tragedy at the time was meant to obey to very strict rules of symmetry and order. And this went not only in terms of the construction of the play, which was highly regulated, unlike, say, English theater, Shakespeare wildly free, mixing comedy and tragedy and so on, but it went also to the very page layout of the classical design. So you see that it's highly, once again, vertical in form, highly symmetrical, the layout. This was considered extremely elegant form, which wasn't practiced at England. And by the end of the 17th century, English authors began to adopt, working with their editors, this French layout. If you read, Shakespeare, you see entries and exits. It's all, the pages are just a mess, right? And to try to organize things symmetrically was associated with the French mind, with the French experience. And so we can think about culture across different genres, different media, with this sense of order. But really stress this, it's not just order, it's not just symmetry, because we talked about these lovely little parterre with the labyrinthine decoration. And you'll notice even here in this highly stripped down page layout, we have these what are called fleurons. We have these sort of vegetal friezes that allow for sort of Baroque interplay, twists and turns and sinuous moves, which also represent the kind of sinuosity and irregularity and asymmetries that take place under, in a sense, the surface of a tragedy, which may obey all of the unities, unity of time, unity of place, but in the end is about passions that cannot be controlled and about their explosive outbreak. Move on. I want to look back at this image. So I've done thus far sort of a bit of a contextualization within the 17th century of what the gardens represent and what this kind of geometrical perspective layout might represent within 17th century and for us. But I just want to remind you, I've switched here quickly to another site, which has nothing to do with 17th century France. This is Teotihuacan, the center of a Mesoamerican empire outside of Mexico City, who had its own classical age in the first half of the first millennium, between the 1st and 6th century. And I just want to make us aware that power often wishes to project itself by large royal ways with large perspectives and these kinds of symmetrical, geometrical forms. So that projection of power, yes, it's very much part of the 17th century context, but it's one that goes back to the Egyptians, to the Assyrians, which is practiced as well in Mesoamerica. And so is, in a sense, we can think of Versailles as the French Teotihuacan. Now, I want to give just a brief history because this question of both power and art is central, just the immediate context of why Versailles was built and how it came to be. And in 1661, Louis XIV was 22 years old. I just want to remind you that in his childhood, between the ages of 8 and 12, there was a civil war in France at the same time as the English civil wars, which was led by a group of aristocrats who were revolting against monarchical control. Louis XIV had to leave Paris and hide. He always associated Paris with revolt afterwards. And hence the move later to actually move not only himself out of Paris to Versailles, but the seat of government, the capital itself, which had been Paris for as long as France had existed under a monarchy. The Louvre was the official seat of power in Paris, of the capital of the monarchy. He moved it to Versailles to escape those the people's power, in a sense. Now, this centralized monarchy had been building for a long time, as it had in other European countries, with the Habsburgs in Spain, with the Stuarts in England. But Louis XIV made a crucial move at the age of 22, once again. At the age of 22, his prime minister died. His mother had died before. And he decided that he would not take a prime minister, that he would rule individually, that he would sign all the papers. And this is what's sort of the crowning moment of what's called the personal reign, or French absolutism. Now, there was a very powerful, the most powerful minister before the death of the prime minister, who saw himself as the next prime minister. His name was Nicolas Fouquet. He's presented right here. In the summer after the death of the prime minister, angling to become the new prime minister, still ignoring Louis's decision not to have a prime minister, he decided it was time to unveil his new palace. He had spent years and accumulated an enormous amount of money as the superintendent of finances of the realm for this palace. He invited Louis XIV the night of August 17, 1661, to the inauguration. There is the palace. It's called Vaux-le-Vicomte. The architect up there, you will see, but I think I don't know if we can eliminate that, but I think you can read pretty well, was Louis Le Vaux. Remember that name, who designed it. The principal decorator, painter, but who also collaborated on architecture for the gardens and so on, was Charles Lebrun. And sometimes I tell my students to remember Charles Lebrun, just think Charlie Brown. That's his name. Charles Lebrun, who was the sort of arts czar soon under Louis XIV, but still quite young here. Fouquet had put together the best team, the best architect, the best painter, and the best gardener, André Le Nôtre, who would later be the gardener of Versailles. And in the gardens, the night of August 17, 1661, for the inauguration, he had Molière, the greatest up-and-coming playwright, perform a new play. The king went, he saw the palace, he saw the paintings, he saw the garden, he saw Molière's performance, and he had Fouquet arrested. Voltaire later said at 6 o'clock in the evening on August 17th, Nicolas Fouquet was the king of France. At 6 a.m. the next morning, he was nothing, right? So literally the project now, remember Louis XIV, 22, has just decided I'm going to be personal ruler of France, right? He snatches the architect, he snatches the painter, and he snatches the gardener. He doesn't literally snatch them. They're all happy to work for the king, and Molière as well, and spends the next 3 years taking what was a hunting lodge of his father, Louis XIII, and turning it into Versailles. So Versailles is inaugurated 3 years later at a festivity where Molière was to perform, where the work of the architect and the gardener and the painter were to be shown off, and in festivities infinitely grander than those of 3 years ago. And those festivities were called the Pleasures of the Enchanted Isle, based on Ariosto's Renaissance romance about crusading knights and magicians, which is one of the kinds of texts, for example, that Cervantes used to parody with Don Quixote, right? That medieval romance tragedy. Inspired by this, put on a series of festivities. And these festivities were not just meant for pleasure, far from it. They were projections of power, and thus they were recorded in luxurious engraving books, which were then distributed and sent to all the diplomats and all the other monarchs of Europe. And as we know, this began the movement of every monarch in Europe and every duke trying to create their own Versailles, right? So here you get a sense, and just remember, this is still very early. This is only 3 years into construction. The chateau is still very small. Over the next 20 years, it's just going to expand exponentially. But notice the importance of the gardens and the conception, right? It's not just a picture of some little chateau. It's a picture of the landscaping around it, which is still in a very early stage. What kind of things went on here? Well, incredible parades featuring, for example, these floats here. The image, the reproduction isn't that clear on this one, but this at the top is Apollo, very important for Louis XIV. We'll talk about that in a second. Mythical gods, these were performed with dances, music, and theater productions. And this is a particularly fascinating one. This is the performance recorded in an engraving at the time of a play by Molière, not one of his best, pastoral comedy, very elegant. You'll notice, though, I think what's particularly interesting for us is the way that the garden's theatricality, right? The perspectives, the way in which it puts power and nature on view with these large perspectives is literally rendered as a stage, right? Into where the stage is constructed from different vegetation pieces, right? Created into columns, lighting dangling from them. The king has, of course, always the central place. There's the king watching the festivity. Immediately, the gardens are conceived of as a site for performance. Another performance which took place in the courtyard, this is an opera that was performed 10 years later, because we don't have an engraving of the first performance which took place in the courtyard, which happened to have been in 1664 for the inauguration of Versailles, Molière's Tartuffe, often considered one of the greatest works of the French 17th century. And fireworks, right? Talking about the mixture of art and play and power. Nothing quite combines them like fireworks, which of course are highly designed, thus art, representing fire, one of the most immutable forces of nature, and projecting power here. The engravings are just fantastic. By the way, there are not many copies of these luxurious folio editions, but the Chicago has one of the only ones, I think one of only 2 sets in the United States at the Newberry Library. So it's something you might want to check out at time. And then more of the illuminations at Versailles. So I want to give you a sense of that interplay, I think particularly as we see it in that stage set for Molière's play, literally constructed of vegetation and integrated into the gardens of art, play, and power. Now I'd like to look at a few examples that'll, I hope, show a little bit of the complexity of this, particularly through fountains. The centerpiece of Versailles was considered to be its fountains, and we'll see more about the technology of that as well. This is one of the great creations of the gardens. It's a little architectural pavilion called the Grotto of Thetis, which was destroyed after only 20 years. This was constructed in the mid-1660s, right at the inauguration of Versailles. And this is an important element to keep in mind. Versailles is going to continually change. Even under Louis XIV, pavilions are constructed and then, oh wait, we can do something bigger, bigger and better. We'll tear this one down. This one was torn down for the expansion of one of the main wings of Versailles, right? And so this, what is a grotto of Thetis? Thetis is a sea nymph, goddess, who was also one of the mistresses of Apollo. And Louis's association with Apollo is very strong. Apollo represents light. Apollo represents the Sun King. Apollo represents the Olympian gods who control the universe, but do so with civilization, with light, as opposed to the preceding generation of the Titans, the giants who represent primordial forces. It's a very complex alignment to think of oneself as an Olympian god in the 17th century. Remember, of course, no one was a pagan in the 17th century in the sense of actually worshipped Zeus or Jupiter, right? So it's a sort of imaginary, playful realm of considering power, but it's linked very much with an idea of civilization. This is Louis XIV's insignia as the sun, and creating the grotto of Thetis, where Apollo would come to rest. We saw Apollo earlier, that fountain, the centerpiece of the royal way. The idea is that when he completes his day, he comes home to the grotto with lovely Thetis, is bathed and served by her nymphs, and experiences the pleasures and delights of love with her. Here is Louis XIV himself, riding out as once again, a projection of power to visit the grotto. And by the way, right here, you see that insignia of Apollo / Louis right here. You get a sense of the gardens and the, typical gardening attire. What you'd wear in the park is a little different today. Not many people have a bow tie of quite that width. The ribbons and so on. And here's the interior. Although this is an architectural piece, it integrates one of the central elements of Le Nôtre's gardens, which is the fountain. This is actually a fountain. There's water continually rolling down the coral, which decorates it. Highly Baroque form. So architecturally, quite classical, right? With the 3 arches, great symmetry, but the matter made of coral, rough stones to give that sense of an underwater realm, and then with ristling water continually changing in flux, gives a sense of sort of hybrid of classical geometry and Baroque exuberance. At the centerpiece is a statue of Apollo, who represents in many ways Louis XIV, surrounded by Thetis, who's washing his feet, and the other nymphs. Now, this is a highly, in a sense, very typical of the 17th century, a very artificial construction. I'm going to jump ahead for a second. We're going to be doing a little bit of the later periods. Just 1 second to the 18th century. And in the mid-18th century, the natural style of the English garden came into vogue. And it was particularly promoted by Marie Antoinette. And some of you may know the Hamlet, which she constructs later in the side palaces of Versailles, begins to develop a much more natural form of gardening. And it was at this period, under Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, that the sculpture, which had already been moved because this pavilion was destroyed, as I said, in the late 17th century, moved to a new setting. Here's the sculpture, a great sculpture by Girardon. And here's the new place. This is radical. This is one of the central bosquets of Versailles. And under Louis XVI, they just destroyed everything in it. We're going to make a new one. And it's going to have hills. It's going to have ungeometrical natural formations. There's not going to be a straight line in the entire thing. All the paths are going to be curved. And it's there in a natural grotto, which is actually constructed, but still looks like nature, that we're going to place Apollo. So I'm just jumping ahead a little bit to think about the way in which later periods are going to reinterpret, even under the French monarchy, before the French Revolution, the whole idea of what Versailles is. All right, now, this idea of a playfulness of the mythical gods in their pleasures in the gardens of Versailles was so important that Louis XIV had commissioned one of the most important painting projects of the late 17th century by an artist named, Jean Cottel, commissioned to do 21 paintings that would decorate the Trianon Palace, which is the palace. We haven't really talked about the Trianon, so what is the Trianon Palace? The Trianon Palace is the palace that Louis XIV built right outside of the main gardens of Versailles in order to escape Versailles. Remember, he built Versailles to escape Paris. But having escaped Paris and Versailles getting so big, he needed a retreat from Versailles. And so he could just walk to the retreat, which was the Grand Trianon. It's called the Grand Trianon now. Why? Because in the 18th century, Louis XV decided that he needed a retreat from the retreat from the retreat, and built the little Trianon, which Marie Antoinette loved. But for Marie Antoinette, it was still a house. It was still a bit palatial. So she decided to build the retreat from the retreat from the retreat from Paris, which was the hamlet, where she could live like a simple peasant with paid servants around her pretending to be peasants. All right, now let's zip back. We're still in the late 17th century. Louis XIV, projections of power, but as a pleasurable activity. And he commissions these paintings, which will decorate the main hall of Trianon, which portray the Greek gods playing around in the fountains of Versailles. And these are actually extremely literal and accurate depictions of the grove garden spaces that we've talked about. This one is the water theater grove, right? Just think about that for a second. I mean, you've got water, you've got grove, nature, trees, but theater, artifice, art, play. So connected, and here we have a depiction of Psyche at the bottom, and the loves of Psyche and Cupid, one of the great myths of Greek antiquity, which, by the way, here you have a picture of Psyche opening presents. The great 17th century fabulist, the author of the fables, La Fontaine, wrote a novel in 1669 that takes place in Versailles, in which the characters walk through the gardens, talk about them. They talk a lot about that grotto of Venice and recount the stories of Psyche and Cupid. And here, I'm going to come back to this question of art and its complicated relationship to power. So in writing this and setting in Versailles, La Fontaine could be considered part of the monarchical project. There was a kind of propagandistic side. Oh, Versailles is the greatest thing you ever saw. A lot of people say that in the novels they're talking. But what is the story? The story is of Psyche and of her vanity as Cupid builds a magnificent palace with magnificent gardens, and she becomes overly narcissistic. She wants to look in the mirror all the time. Now, for those of you who know Versailles, you may think mirrors, the Hall of Mirrors, right? So La Fontaine, who always had a difficult relationship with the king, is writing a work set in the gardens of Versailles that is at the same time flattering to the king, but perhaps extremely critical. It depends on the lenses you're wearing. It depends on how deeply you want to read between the text. I'll just show you a few more of these wonderful Cotel images of the gods frolicking and give you a sense. These are the best representations we have of what the gardens would look like in the 17th century with the full fountains flowing. By the way, all the fountains never flowed at the same time, even in the 17th century. That demanded much too much water, and we'll get to that in a second. Here we have a great story known to us all, the Judgment of Paris, in which the goddesses Venus and Diana and Juno compete to be the most beautiful. Paris has to judge them, and that's the beginning of Helen's story, Trojan War, and so on, but set again in one of the fabulous fountain creations at Versailles with the gods floating on top. Once again, as I suggested, these paintings, which depict pure pleasure, are part of a political project. And this meant not only were they decorating the palace, that there was going to be engraving books. The engraving books would be sent all through to all the courts of Europe, to all the diplomats. So the various kings, Charles II in England, could say, man, we got to get a Versailles. We've got to get a place that looks like this. Now, I'm going to go to one of my favorite sculptures and the centerpiece in many ways of the royal alley, the royal way, the central axis of the gardens of Versailles, and that's the Latona fountain. Just to get a sense of its centrality, There's the Latona fountain. This is the view that you would have, we'll see in a second, from the Great Gallery, from the Hall of Mirrors, from the palace facade going down. There at the end, you see the Apollo fountain where we began. So we're looking at the same perspective we saw at the beginning from the other side. And there is Latona. Who is Latona? I'll tell that in a second. Here's a closer look at the sculpture. This also is the late 17th century version, but the first version, which was begun in the 1670s, didn't have this sort of pyramidal terraced setting, but it did have these wonderful figures. And when I experience Versailles with my students who don't know this story, I say, look at these figures. What are they? And what the hell is going on here? Here's a woman, outstretched arms. There are actually two children under at her waist. We'll see that in a second. And then these figures. Now, those are kind of hard to see. So let's close up a little bit on them. Now we see Latona. You can kind of see the little children here. And then you see these weird figures. Now, I'm just going to take a second, excuse me, parentheses, but we're talking about experiencing Versailles. This is a wonderful picture because here you get what the modern experience of Versailles is. And this is by a fabulous photographer, very well known, Martin Parr, who specializes in taking pictures of crowds in museums among artworks. And I love the interplay here of the hair, of the tourists, the taking a picture, right? The crowds. It's almost like this is a fountain, but doesn't this look like a theatrical set? I mean, they're more like bleachers, the steps behind them, everybody looking down. Of course, they're also looking at the full perspective, and they're looking at Latona. And here we see Latona in the first version, right? As I say, everything changes at Versailles. With it, 1670, it was constructed as the same figures, but as a flat surface. And 20 years later, it's lifted up in a more dramatic form. Okay, what is Latona? I've teased this enough. Latona. So what is this figure? Do I have one more? Yes, let's stop there. There you see these fabulous, this is the centerpiece of Versailles. And what are these frogs doing in the center of Versailles? And what is these people that are like half frogs doing at the center of Versailles? Latona, in Greek, Leto, is the mother of Apollo. The mother of Apollo and Diana. The mother of Apollo who was a temporary consort of Jupiter, one of Jupiter's loves. She, though, a mere mortal, gave birth to the two children, was thrown out of her town, was on the road seeking shelter. She arrived in Lycia. There are different versions of where she arrives, but she arrives at a village, a swampy village, and tries to take a drink of water. And the peasants, the local inhabitants, apparently don't like visitors. Maybe they're xenophobic. They're not hospitable. So they mush up the water. They stamp in the water to make it muddy. So poor Latona, with these poor little children, cannot drink from it. What does Latona do? Well, you've seen the picture before. Her outstretched arms, she calls to Jupiter. And she says to Jupiter, punish these people. And what does Jupiter do? He turns them into frogs. And this is from Ovid's Metamorphosis. And this is the moment in which the peasants who have rebelled against Jupiter, who have insulted the mother of Apollo, are punished. So is the centerpiece of Versailles a big watch out sign, a big be careful because I can take revenge sign? And we laugh, yes, but remember, there are very real political implications here. I'm going to mention too quickly, a little bit of a different perspective on Versailles. It is where Louis XIV signed the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes at the end of the 16th century offered full religious freedom to the Protestants. Louis XIV ended that religious freedom and began an incredibly terrible persecution campaign against the Huguenots, who then fled throughout Europe, much to the enrichment of the Netherlands to Germany and England and America, and much to the impoverishment of France itself. But there's a dark side to Louis XIV's reign, to say the least. At the same time, roughly the same year, in the mid-1680s, Louis XIV issued the Black Code, as the Code Noir, which was the regulation of slavery in the colonies, which was one of the first documents to establish strict racial hierarchies. And so this the exercise of power was also an exercise of oppression, of persecution. So when we see those frogs, we can think of the Huguenots, we can think of slaves in the colonies, we can think of others as well. But we are thinking about them. And that's where I'm going to end this little, to what extent might the artists not be endorsing the idea of powerful people turning their opponents into frogs? To what extent are we as a viewer to question that? See, well, we're going to see some stronger, there's a lovely frog, should have shown that earlier. And this is all based on a tale in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Last point about this, Ovid. Louis XIV modeled himself on the Emperor Augustus. The Emperor Augustus was, of course, the height of Roman power, but also the height of cultural power. I've mentioned Virgil, I've mentioned Horace, and Ovid. But Ovid was a very tricky poet, and they loved Ovid in the 17th century. But Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, had Ovid banished for immorality. So the very glory of the height of the Roman Empire and Augustus is associated with a poet, which really incarnates the cultural power which was stressed across millennia. One of the most canonical poets in our tradition, Ovid, who was in many ways an opponent and critique of that power. So that kind of dynamic is one that we can continue to think about, and I'm going to return to with a couple more sculptures. But first, I'm just going to remind everyone that water does not just flow from rain down to animate all of these fountains, which took millions of gallons a day to operate. More water daily used for those fountains than for the entire city of Paris, which at that time had over 500,000 inhabitants. More. So 17th century is a period of great hydraulic engineering, the control of nature, the control of water. I'm simply flying through this quickly. Here you get a sense of some of the waterworks. This is Versailles with sort of little naval plays that were done. I just kind of wanted to present that first, but think about two 17th century examples of hydraulics. One is the canal belt in Amsterdam. The creation, if you've been to the canal belt, this beautiful, and indeed one of the great architectural and hydraulic creations of the 17th century with Versailles. The Piazza Navona, and in general, the fountains of Rome, which had been in neglect since Roman times, from the late Renaissance, but particularly the 17th century, saw the creation of these great fountains, including perhaps the most famous, Bernini, who had a wonderful trip to Versailles, to Paris, which we could talk about later in the question and answer section, but the sculptor Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers, one of the most impressive fountains of the 17th century. And just a reminder again, that fountain, which we look at with such beauty today, if we're in the Piazza Navona and having a gelato and just enjoying the play, the refreshing spray of water coming from it, the wonderful Baroque interplay. Remember, those four rivers represent the four continents, unknown at the time, Americas then being considered one continent, Africa, Asia, and Europe, and the Catholic Church's domination of those continents, of those four rivers. Now, how did the water get up there? Well, this is the greatest hydraulic creation of the 17th century. It's called the machine of Marly. This was created in the late 17th century. It brought up, as I said, more water, millions of gallons a day than to the entire city of Paris. From the river Seine, from the Seine, it goes up the mountain and then to the aqueduct, which will take it to Versailles. You get a sense of the importance of these water wheels. The mill wheels are over 40 feet in diameter, right? This is a giant creation. So again, the technology behind these fountains is crucial. Now, I want to do two more things before I stop. And I know time is always fleeting. And the first is to maybe look at two 17th century sculptures in Versailles, their works in Versailles, and then to turn to particularly contemporary art installations in the gardens of Versailles. The first is the Enceladus Grove. This is a sculpture from the 1670s by the great sculptor Marcy. It's also a fountain because you see this figure of Enceladus, so I'm going to tell you about him in a second, shouting. When the fountain is running, water pours out of that mouth. And he's also, once again, set with these rocks around him, a fountain around him, a pool, and then once again, the greenery, the trellises, the vines, the trees above, wonderfully set in nature. Here he is a little, what a figure, right? Enceladus is a titan, a giant of the generation previous to the Olympian gods. I won't go to the story of how the Olympian gods overturn the children of the giants or titans, overturn the rule of these primitive giant monsters who ruled the universe, but they did, and that was their triumph. And Jupiter himself, the son of Saturn, who was a titan, killed this particular giant who was revolting, whose name is Enceladus, and buried him under a heap of rocks. And that heap of rocks, you know better, perhaps as Mount Etna, according to the story, right? That Mount Etna, so the idea that under volcanoes are buried titans, buried primordial forces, waiting to escape and occasionally get a little bit out with that rushing fire. Why put that in a central grove in Versailles? Why? Okay, I'll give you the two one's the propagandistic interpretation, which is no doubt true. Look at it. I mean, he's hurling a rock, but he's being buried. And Jupiter / Apollo, the Olympian gods, are controlling, containing, destroying him. So anarchy, chaos, revolt, maybe the people, maybe nature itself is being contained. And yet, like a sore pimple waiting to break out, there he is, hurling a rock at us, by the way, up to the sky, but it might hit us as spectators. Is this a reminder that you can't control nature, as gardens try to, that you perhaps cannot control the people, that civilization will fall or has weaknesses? You begin to think of all the different, I'm not giving one of these interpretations, but that our experience is at the same time one of a kind of control of those primordial forces, but also thinking about their presence, as though all of Paris, remember we built Versailles to escape Paris, as though all of that primal energy in Paris may be channeling underneath the earth and ready to break out in the center of Versailles at any time, hurling rocks. It's not such a fantasy, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, I'll move on, just wonderful. I mean, incredible piece. And then perhaps the greatest French sculptor of the 17th century, Pierre Puget's Milo of Croton. So I'll just show you the sculpture first. That's a close-up in the gardens. There you get, this is where, I wonder if I can eliminate that. Stop share, maybe? No, I better not. It's okay. And you can, yeah, because you don't see his head. So it would be lovely if we could just, great. Yeah, sorry. There you see him twisted around in the gardens. Now, all right, no problem. That seems to have ended my remote control. So I'm just gonna now move this here. Be careful. And then I use okay, back to Milo in the gardens. What is the story of Milo of Croton? Milo was the greatest athlete of his time. This is roughly the 6th century BC. We know this through legend in Greece. He won all the Olympic Games. He then became a very important general. So he was considered physically the strongest, but also militarily the strongest. He was a hero. This is someone who represents the kind of strength that Louis XIV wants to project. what happens to Milo? Well, he's a little vain. He likes to show off his strength. And as an older man, he comes upon a tree which has been rent in the middle, which has, been divided in the middle, and there are wedges in there. And he says, I'm going to just rip that tree in two. Let me show you how strong I am. Sticks his hands in to rip the tree in two, to control nature, to show his mastery over it. The wedges that were holding it apart fall, and his hands are trapped. He is caught by the trees of Versailles, by the trees of nature he wishes to control. His hands caught, he is then devoured by lions. Nature takes its revenge on the man who thought he could control nature. And to drive the point home, at the bottom, what do we see of the statue? Well, right here. Oh, great, I can't do that anymore. Dramatic pause. How do I control it here? I'm not getting any.
Oh, there's little.
Well, so I can go back now. Yes, sure. You can see actually a little bit here, but I'm going to skip. Right. So what are at his feet? The cup, that's a trophy. That's an Olympian trophy. The ribbon, another decoration. The ivy, that's harder to see. The ivy crown, all thrown at his feet, destroyed by the forces of nature. Now, this is just absolutely incredible. This piece was commissioned knowingly by the king's lieutenant, Charles Lebrun, the Tsar of Arts, who thought it'd be a great subject for Versailles. And when we go, now it's true, we may just look and we're in the gardens. It was also, once again, engravings were made. Hey, everybody, see what wonderful works of art are at Versailles. And yet the very engravings describe the moral of the story, overcome by art, by the vain use of his strength. Right there. Now, you passing by may not think about it, but you do see something. You see, no matter what you know of the story, you see a man being eaten by a lion. And if you look a little bit more, you see his hand stuck in a tree. And you're in Versailles with all those trees. So this is extremely complicated. And this is not something that ends with the 17th century, that kind of complicated play. So just a reminder, this entire garden was a backdrop for what? For the Hall of Mirrors. This is the view of the hall, from the central Hall of Mirrors down through the gardens. The Hall of Mirrors itself was the site not only of the exercise of power, but the projection with foreign diplomats and with France's colonial and imperial ambitions in the first colonial period of the late 17th century. Here we see Louis XIV being greeted by a bowing diplomat from Persia, right? Turkish embassies from Siam, embassies from Morocco, all received at Versailles, all get the same garden tour. And the garden tour wasn't, hey, meet you for coffee in a half hour, go see the gardens. Just to be clear, Louis XIV himself wrote a book called How to Show the Gardens of Versailles. And if you read this, it uses the imperative future. You will first see, you will then walk to, right? And this is the manuscript version at the time. He considered the gardens and the visit of the gardens essential part of diplomacy and impressing foreign sovereigns. Okay, now what do we do? Okay, this is just a reminder, the end of Versailles. This is the Women's March on Versailles. So, of course, we all know the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789. Declaration of the Rights of Man follows as the National Assembly is at Versailles, which is still the capital. The king in the early months is quite reticent and very much putting himself in opposition to the National Assembly. Also, the economic hardship continues for the people of Paris. And in October, 3 months after the storming of the Bastille, the women of Paris, this is entirely a women's march by foot from Paris to Versailles to take the king back. And they do. And that is the end of Versailles as the capital of France. It's no longer the capital. Now, their desire, by the way, just to be clear, was not to kill the king. The king isn't executed until 3 years later, after many other events. Their thought is, we want the king back in Paris so he can be with us and see us. And he's the sovereign, he should know what we're going through, right? And that separation between Versailles and Paris is now ended. Now, what do we do in the 21st century? And there I'll conclude with a few of the contemporary installations. This is the first large-scale fountain installation built at Versailles since the French Revolution, in over 200 years. In 2015, this was commissioned. It's a wonderful play, and as many of the artists and landscape designers who've come back to Versailles, they're very interested in both working with the spirit, the history of Versailles, and doing so with modern interpretations. Otonil is a great contemporary artist, known particularly for his work with glass beads. And here we see a close-up of the fountain called Les Belles Danses, the beautiful dances, and which the designs, which you see here, are based, believe it or not, on Foyer's choreographic notations, which are among the first choreographic notations in history of dance moves, which form these wonderful patterns. And he took those patterns of dances that were performed at Versailles and turned them into the fountain design. And what does he say about this? This is my Republican project. This fountain is literally for the public. It serves the people. This is a complicated subject, but the way in which Versailles, after the French Revolution, and particularly after the Third Republic in 1870, France has been a republic since then, has been converted into a republican space rather than a monarchical space, and one that is democratic in its functioning, or attempts to be, and we'll see some issues with that, while still playing with and understanding its monarchical past. And this is just a reminder again of the ephemeral quality of the garden, which is subject to storms. Why was this fountain built? Because of the horrible storms that ripped through Versailles in 1999, which destroyed thousands of trees. This is a site of that destruction. And that is where, in the very water grove we looked at earlier in the Cotel paintings, destroyed earlier actually, but then that space destroyed by the 1999 fires. But I just want to make it clear, storms didn't start in 1999. And here we have a wonderful painting, sorry, there's a little cover there, of Hubert Robert, the famous Robert, the great painter of ruins. The Art Institute has some of his greatest works. Depicts Versailles after the moment of a storm damage, which has destroyed the trees. Now, playing on this riff of trees, starting in 2010, with a very controversial exhibition by Jeff Koons, the Versailles decided each year to turn it over to a leading international artist to create massive installations both inside the palace and in the gardens. And given our discussion today about nature, control, art, power, I wanted to start with Giuseppe Pannoni's installations, which include this upside down tree. And the way we can think a tree not made of organic material, but made of artificial materials. That, by the way, just is very 17th century, because some of the early garden designs had metallic trees as part of this painted, shimmering, playful, in nature, right? And so those ideas of mixing artifice and nature, very deeply tied in the 17th century. But here, right next to the Apollo fountain, the representation of Louis XIV, we see what can only be called a sort of total reversal of hierarchies. The head, is reversed here. The roots are at the top. The tree goes down. Olafur Eliasson created this wonderful sculpture that appears to be a sort of water fountain issuing from the sky, because you don't see the structure that holds it up at the Grand Canal. Again, right before the Apollo fountain. You can see that's the view of it, which I'd shown you before, but you may not have caught it, from the Hall of Mirrors. And what does he say about this? It's we're going to end with just a couple of quotes. The Versailles that I've been dreaming of is a place that empowers everyone. Once again, this democratization, this idea of can we democratize a site of monarchy. It invites visitors to take control and authorship of their experience instead of simply consuming and being dazzled by the grandeur. Well, I'd argue we all know that being dazzled was Louis XIV's project, but we also know that 17th century people had enough freedom of mind to also often be authors of their own experience in the garden. It asks them to exercise their senses, to embrace the unexpected, to drift through the gardens, and to feel the landscape take shape through their movements. That's another Olafur, but I'll skip that. Now, this is my last major thing, and I'm going to end with one footnote. But this was a very important Anish Kapoor, known to most Chicagoans as the artist of the bean, was given Versailles in 2015, and he created this enormous rusty canal with an open tube called Dirty Corner, and with rocks strewn around. Now, now you've maybe seen enough to begin to think, gosh, rocks thrown around. Well, think about Enceladus, who we saw before, underneath all those rocks trying to get out. Think about hydraulics. This buried under Versailles are enormous tubes of water, enormous systems of irrigation to bring that water up. Now exposed, called Dirty Corner. Well, perhaps perhaps not the wisest remark that Anish Kapoor ever made. Perhaps, we can debate it. At a certain point, he compared the orifice of the tube here to the Queen's sexual organs. This raised a lot of ire, not so much among feminists, but among those who treasure France's monarchical traditions, among others. And it was then defaced in the summer of 2015 by far-right nationalists who, I won't repeat what's written there, but who have filled it with anti-Semitic graffiti. Anti-Semitic because, in part, Anish Kapoor, who's Indian, is Jewish Indian. But that this is a national disgrace. This is a violation of the French nation. So still today, one can debate what Anish Kapoor was doing, but part of this democratization project, part of trying to see this in a critical lens, meets opposition that becomes very controversial. And I'll just read this little quote. One of the biggest scandals of 2015 was the controversy surrounding Anish Kapoor's Dirty Corner at France's Palace of Versailles that repeatedly became the target of vandalism. Now the artist says the blame goes straight to the top. Kapoor, I believe it was an inside job, Kapoor told the South China Morning Post. Kapoor alleges that the largely funded efforts to remove the first round of graffiti, alleges that he funded. Versailles was pathetic, he added. When the statue was vandalized a second time with anti-Semitic graffiti, Kapoor opted not to go through the effort of cleaning it again. It was an act of protest, but it was not without consequences. Ultimately, the graffiti remained, although it was covered up with gold leaf in accordance with the court's ruling, and the work was put in storage. Very complicated, right? So Kapoor is basically alleging that the wonderful efforts of the Versailles establishment to democratize still is led by ultra-conservative forces. We can argue also, we can think about Kapoor's decision to keep he wanted the anti-Semitic graffiti to remain as a sign to everyone that this still exists. Versailles won the court case and covered it, but with gold leaf, which seems to me outrageous. These continuing contestations, and I'm going to end with maybe a happier contemporary exhibition. The only one by a woman artist. There haven't been a lot of women present in this presentation, but Joana Vasconcelos is an incredible Portuguese artist who had Versailles in 2012. Among other things, she created household items, again, part of this democratization effort, in the gardens. Here we see a teapot, below a jug of wine, and the main attraction of her exhibition were the high heel shoes, which she called Marilyn's shoes, but a reference both to Marie Antoinette and Marilyn Monroe, made entirely out of kitchen pots. And that was in the Hall of Mirrors. And I'll end today with this beautiful quote from her, which I think summarizes so much of what we've been talking about. My work is developed around the idea that the world is an opera. Again, that theatricality we've seen from the beginning. And Versailles embodies the operatic and aesthetic ideal that inspires me. The works that I propose exist for this place. So she, like all these artists, she created these new pieces for the exhibition or chose those that she had worked on before just for the sites that she selected in the gardens and in the palace. I see them as linked to Versailles in a timeless way. When I stroll through the rooms of the palace and its gardens, I feel the energy of a setting that gravitates between reality and dreams. I'm thinking back right now simply at those Cotel paintings that had wonderful architectural reproductions of the fountains where Venus and Psyche and gods are playing around and floating in the air. Reality and dreams, the everyday and the magic, the festive and the tragic. We've seen a little bit of both of those. I can still hear the echo of the footsteps of Marie Antoinette, the music and festive ambience of the stately rooms. How would the life of Versailles look if this exuberant and grandiose universe was transferred to our period and our experience of Versailles? It's the question I leave us with. Thank you. No doubt we're over time, and I apologize.
Well, thank you, Larry. Thank you for everybody who's been listening online, attentively, and in the room. We have a few minutes for questions, a bit less than I expected, but
I take the blame.
We took this fantastic trip to the ages, and I was really appreciative of the way you finished with now and,
Yes.
this modern art and what it means in Versailles. So I would invite people in the room to let me know if they have questions. Oh, there will be many. I'll start at the front there. Madame, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, madame.
And I just need to repeat your question so everybody hears it.
Thank you, because I don't really project
Right.
loudly. You've emphasized Versailles as a political project, and I wondered if you would comment on the concept. And one of the purposes of Louis XIV in building Versailles was to compel the centralization of the French nobility, so as to prevent the outbreak of another point.
Yes.
Can you repeat our question?
Yes,
Because
no, the question is.
you know what she's talking about.
Yes, the question concerns the political project of Versailles, of which I've spoken in terms of projection of power, diplomatic power, et cetera, but that she has raised, very pertinently, that it was also a question of the containment of the nobility. So the tension between monarchical, when the monarchy increases its power, centralizes the state in a modern state, run by bureaucratic organizations that extend across the nation. And often those the ministers involved were actually of the bourgeoisie and not of the aristocracy. That power is taken from the aristocracy. And the civil wars, when Louis XIV was young, was a revolt of the aristocracy against the monarchy in this deprivation of their own powers and their domestication. And that's the key term. And Versailles was indeed conceived of, particularly by writers at the time like Saint Simon, who famously wrote about the way in which Louis XIV constructed Versailles as a gilded cage to contain the aristocracy, to keep it from revolting. How? Partly through pleasures, through all of these, right here, I built you your own Las Vegas. Enjoy. And I laugh. We haven't talked about gambling because, what happened inside the palace more than anything else? Gambling. Louis XIV had gambling evenings every week. It was central to what was going on inside. So it contains them in this pleasure palace. But it's not just that. He created this sense of competition and emulation among the nobility to be closer to the king in the ceremonies of the palace. So instead of worrying about, actually having control of your own, domain, feudal domain, you're just trying to basically do things like take the chamber pot to the king. I'm not kidding. To be every morning and evening at the dressing of the king, right? So this domestication of a class, absolutely central. Thank you.
Okay, with the white shirt here, madame.
How was Fouquet able to identify all that talent?
Fouquet was a fascinating character. There's a parentheses, there's a wonderful play by Nick, oh my gosh, I suddenly forget his name. I was going to say Nick Power. The play is called Power. It was written about 15 years ago about Fouquet and Louis XIV. He was a very, a man of amazing cultivation and capacity. And so being in the center of power, because he was the superintendent of finances, right? He had the means and the interest and the knowledge. He knew these writers, he knew these artists. He was watching the cultural scene very closely. And he picked those people. And in a sense, Louis XIV may have had a bit of an eye for the arts, but when we think of these great figures, La Fontaine also began as protected by Fouquet. Molière, protected by Fouquet. The artist, gardener, Le Nôtre, all under Fouquet. So in many ways, Louis XIV just happened to luck into inheriting those. Yeah. Fascinating character, yeah.
All right, Pauline, I think unfortunately that will be our last question because we really ran a bit longer.
Yeah, I know.
Larry, thank you. Pauline.
You showed the work of Anish Kapoor and,
Yes.
and told us about our being here in Chicago, which is also known as the Cloud Gate.
Thank you, which is the original, yeah.
And I would say that while I've seen many photographs of the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles,
Yeah.
they're always like along the length.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder really if what those mirrors were doing was reflecting in infinity, the perspective
Yes.
in the other direction. And
Yeah.
perhaps if when you were standing in that window looking at the gardens, if you had rotated,
Yes,
you would actually see that those gardens then would continue in
That's right.
infinity in the other direction, much kind of like the work of Anish Kapoor kind of reflects the infinity of the universe. And so in a way, there's a parallel there, I think, and I don't know, I wish maybe we could see a picture in the other direction.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So the question was about Anish Kapoor and Cloudgate, the beam, which is a mirrored construction, which infinitely reflects that around it. And the relationship to the Hall of Mirrors, which we've looked at, but the mirrors are all on one side, and on the other side are the giant windows of equal size, which look out into the gardens. And so what the Hall of Mirrors was designed to do was to give the appearance that you had gardens on both sides, that you were in this sort of narrow gallery floating above the gardens, right? Architecturally, it was impossible to build it. Also, climate control wasn't that great. If you had just a glass, it would be basically sort of a glass room. So this allowed that perception. Absolutely. The Hall of Mirrors was also, though, very much a statement of the technological power of France, because it was the largest mirrored surface, although made up of small mirrors architecturally at the time, as France was trying to compete with and overtake Venice as the mirror-making capital of Europe. So there's always that, back to that technical and economic side. But I love that, the Kapoor, the way we could think of being in the Cloud Gate and then being in the Hall of Mirrors. It would be great to be able to sort of teleport oneself between one and the other and think about that.
The LA of the long room.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, okay, one last question, but we'll just have to make this one quick, Madame.
Where are these contemporary sculptures now? Where do they reside?
Yeah, so it depends on the artist, but the artist keeps them, and each one, each exhibition at Versailles, there's wonderful catalogs, and I think sometimes they talk about where it goes after, but they've gone back to basically to the artist to do as they wish. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they're so big. Where do you put that afterwards? I know. Yeah, well, okay, I know we got to end, but I'll just, one of them you may know, which is the first installation, Jeff Koons, and in front of the most important statue of Louis XIV in Versailles, right next to the Hall of Mirrors, he put Michael Jackson and Bubbles, his wonderful ceramic polychrome creation, and the relationship between Michael Jackson and Neverland and Louis XIV and Versailles is one that we can all think about over lunch.
Larry, thank you so much. So just to wrap up, we'd like to thank everybody who's with us in the auditorium for a return in post-pandemic time, still with your safety at heart. We want to thank everybody that is online and listening to this wonderful talk by Larry. The next symposium is on September 22nd. It will be the guests will be online, but we will be in the auditorium with you. And also I want to say we will also have a series of film screening about French nostalgia, glamour that starts on September 23rd. There is a brochure about our upcoming cultural season that is around the building. We'll make sure you get one. For everybody who stays with us, please exit left when you get out of the auditorium. And thank you again to Larry and to all of you. Thank you.